What happened in there? The nightmare of Saudia Flight 163. Fire is one of the biggest fears for pilots, and for good reasons. When the Lockheed L-1011 TriStar was introduced in 1972, it was the most advanced airliner of its time. It was designed to compete with the McDonnell Douglas DC-10 and had many features that other planes wouldn't adopt for years. However, today's story is about one of the airlines that flew this impressive aircraft, Saudia, Saudi Arabia's national airline. Saudia mainly used the L-1011 for long flights but occasionally used it for domestic routes, like flights to Jeddah, the main airport for pilgrims traveling to Mecca. In August 1980, the Hajj pilgrimage season hadn't started yet, but Saudia's L-1011 flight from Karachi, Pakistan, to Jeddah, with a stop in Riyadh, was fully booked. On August 19, the flight left Karachi at 4:32 p.m. Saudi time and arrived in Riyadh after 2.5 hours. Once in Riyadh, passengers got off to go through customs, as was required for all travelers back then. In 1980, baggage checks were very basic, without X-rays or scanners like today. Passengers were simply told what items were not allowed, but there wasn't much enforcement. This made it easier for dangerous items to be brought onto planes. Most people also didn't know all the rules, which meant items like matches could sometimes catch fire in luggage. On this flight, investigators later found banned items in both the cabin and cargo areas, including a can of diesel oil and a butane stove, things that should not have been on board. Since it's hard to completely stop such items from being brought onto planes, even with modern technology, the L-1011, like all passenger planes, was equipped with many fire detection and suppression systems. According to international rules, different areas of a plane are given fire protection ratings based on their size and how easy they are to access. For example, an overhead bin, Class A, doesn't need a fire suppression system because the cabin crew can easily see a fire and put it out with a handheld extinguisher. Saudia's L-1011s had 11 such extinguishers placed throughout the plane for quick access. Class B compartments, which are less visible to the crew but still reachable, must have smoke detectors and can be accessed by the crew if needed. Class C compartments, like cargo holds under the floor, cannot be reached during flight, so they are equipped with both smoke detectors and fire suppression systems that can be activated from the cockpit. Some cargo compartments used to be classified as Class D. If you check modern guides, you'll see the list skips from Class C to Class E, and by the end of this story, you'll understand why. In the past, Class D compartments were considered fireproof because they were designed to cut off oxygen, so a fire would burn out before spreading. These compartments didn't need fire suppression systems or smoke detectors. On the L-1011, the C3 baggage compartment, located under the back of the passenger cabin, was considered Class D. This C3 compartment was approved for transporting animals, so it was pressurized and ventilated during flights. However, this ventilation could feed a fire with oxygen, so to meet Class D standards, Lockheed added 2 smoke detectors and a system to cut off air if smoke was detected. The compartment also had a special fire-resistant liner to hold off a fire until the oxygen ran out, at least, that was the theory. When Class D regulations were created in the 1960s, authorities had to decide how much air could flow into a compartment without keeping a fire alive. They decided that for a 500 cubic foot compartment, up to 1,500 cubic feet of air per hour would be okay. If the air inside the compartment was replaced less than 3 times per hour, a fire wouldn't get enough oxygen to keep burning. But over time, larger planes with bigger compartments came into service. The C3 compartment on the L-1011 was 700 cubic feet, and other planes, like the 747, had even bigger compartments. So, Lockheed and the FAA simply increased the air limit proportionally, allowing up to 2,100 cubic feet of air per hour in a 700 cubic foot compartment. Since the system could cut off air entirely during a fire, they thought the compartment would be safe. However, there was a problem. A larger compartment naturally contains more oxygen, about 40% more in the case of the L-1011 C3 compartment. No one tested whether the materials used for fireproof liners could withstand a fire that had access to this much extra oxygen, meaning a fire could burn for longer than expected. This oversight would become crucial in understanding what happened next. The pilots of Flight 163 had no idea about the vulnerability in their cargo hold, and neither did anyone else. But the crew had other issues we need to discuss to understand what happened. The captain was 38 years old with over 7,600 flight hours. He had flown various aircraft like the DC-3, DC-6, DC-9, and 737, but he had only 388 hours on the L-1011, having recently upgraded to this plane. The bigger concern was his training record. It showed he struggled when faced with unexpected situations, was often behind the aircraft in his decision-making, learned slowly, and needed more training than usual. Unfortunately, the first officer wasn't much help either. At 26, he had 1,615 hours of flight experience, but he had only been certified to fly the L-1011 12 days before the flight, with just 125 hours on this aircraft. His records also suggested that he wasn't fully prepared to be in the cockpit that day. This unfortunate pairing of an inexperienced captain and first officer would play a key role in the events that followed. The first officer began his flight training in November 1974 in Miami, but by September 1975, the training center reported his poor performance. Saudia recommended he be dropped, which he was in October. However, in March 1977, he was reinstated by a committee action, possibly due to personal connections. Although the report doesn't detail why he struggled, reinstating someone who failed previously is rarely a good decision. There was also a third crew member, a 42-year-old American flight engineer. He had 650 hours in this position but only 157 on the L-1011. He started as a captain on the DC-3 in 1974, then switched to first officer on the Boeing 737 in 1975. After failing training, he was terminated in 1978 but later appealed and was allowed to train as a flight engineer, which he passed, and he rejoined Saudia. It's also noted that he may have had dyslexia, though this wasn't officially confirmed. This crew was inexperienced. All had fewer than 400 hours on the L-1011, with 2 under 200 hours. 2 of them had failed training and were reinstated for non-merit reasons. At the time, Saudia had no system to prevent inexperienced crews from being paired, a common safety practice today. Furthermore, the crew came from different countries, with varying language skills, which could hinder communication. In 1980, they didn't receive much training in crew resource management, CRM, a critical skill for effective teamwork in aviation today. After boarding 287 passengers and 14 crew, the captain briefed the crew and completed checks. At 8:50 p.m., the flight pushed back from the gate, and the engines were started. After taxiing to the runway, Flight 163 took off at 9:08 p.m., climbed normally, and was cleared to 35,000 feet. The crew completed their checklists, and the flight engineer informed operations of their estimated arrival time. Everything was going smoothly until about 7 minutes after takeoff, when an alarm sounded in the cockpit. The flight engineer saw that the smoke detector in the aft C3 cargo hold had been triggered, indicating a potential fire, one of the most serious emergencies in aviation. Though we don't know exactly what caused the fire, it likely started near the top of the luggage in the cargo hold. The fire produced enough smoke to set off one of the 2 smoke detectors, which automatically cut off the ventilation to the cargo hold. Since this was a Class D compartment, it wasn't equipped with fire extinguishers because it was assumed the fire would burn out due to lack of oxygen. Unfortunately, this design had a flaw. In reality, the fire burned through the fire-resistant liner and spread into the space between the cabin floor and cargo hold, where it found a steady supply of oxygen. At this point, the fire became uncontrollable. Uncontained fires on board are extremely dangerous, and studies show that once a fire starts, the average time to lose an aircraft is about 17 minutes. Today, even the smallest sign of fire triggers immediate emergency landings, but back in 1980, the procedures were less clear. The crew was confused by the initial smoke alarm, and the captain hesitated, thinking it might be a false alarm. He only considered turning back after a second smoke detector went off, but instead of returning right away, he allowed the plane to keep climbing. Another problem was with the checklist system. Saudia's checklists were divided into abnormal and emergency sections with no clear labeling. The flight engineer spent nearly 3 minutes searching the wrong section, delaying the response. Although his possible dyslexia may have added to the confusion, the poor checklist design would have likely confused anyone in that situation. The crew should have been familiar with the cargo smoke checklist from their recent training, so searching for it shouldn't have taken so long. Instead, the flight engineer spent time running unnecessary tests to confirm the smoke alarm, even though it was already clear there was a fire. After searching without success, he suggested checking the cabin for smoke himself, and the captain agreed. While the flight engineer was gone, the captain asked the first officer to request a turn back to Riyadh, though they were already 60 miles away and still climbing. The captain then found the checklist himself and criticized the flight engineer, calling him a jackass, revealing a lack of trust between the crew members. This mistrust was significant because the captain depended on the flight engineer for updates on the fire. At 2020, the flight engineer returned, confirming the fire, which prompted the captain to stop climbing and begin turning back. The first officer informed air traffic control but didn't declare an emergency. However, the crew had already wasted over 4 minutes flying away from Riyadh, adding critical minutes to their return. Soon after, a flight attendant rushed into the cockpit, shouting, "Fire in the cabin!" The fire had breached the cargo liner and was spreading into the cabin, causing bursts of smoke to emerge and terrifying passengers. Despite this, flight attendants kept passengers calm using announcements in 3 languages, and most remained seated. The first officer notified air traffic control of the cabin fire and large number of passengers, while the captain sent the flight engineer to check the situation again. The engineer returned and reported less smoke, with no visible flames, saying, "It's just smoke in the aft." After the fire initially filled the cabin with smoke, it seemed to decrease, possibly because airflow reversed, pulling the smoke back under the floor. The flight engineer thought the situation was improving and reported this to the captain. However, the fire was still spreading below the floor. Passengers were panicking, but the captain didn't acknowledge the seriousness of the situation. Soon after, the captain noticed that the throttle for the number 2 engine was stuck, likely because the fire had damaged the control cables. When a flight attendant reported a fire near the L4 exit, the crew tried to put it out, but the real fire was in the cargo hold below, beyond their reach. The flight engineer didn't fully grasp the severity of the situation, and his comments that things were okay may have misled the captain. The captain remained focused on flying, rather than managing the emergency. He didn't communicate well with the cabin crew, who were dealing with chaos in the cabin. Meanwhile, the flight engineer kept testing the smoke alarm, and the first officer followed instructions without taking initiative. As they descended toward Riyadh, flight attendants struggled to control the panicking passengers. The pilots discussed fire trucks and runway details but didn't share evacuation plans with the crew. Multiple times, flight attendants asked the captain if they should prepare for an evacuation, but he ignored their requests. Even as the plane neared landing, the captain's focus remained on procedures rather than the urgent need to get people off the plane. Despite the increasing chaos, the captain never fully grasped the danger of the situation. He even instructed the crew not to evacuate, a baffling decision under the circumstances. It's possible he either misunderstood the severity of the fire, misled by the flight engineer's reports, or was overwhelmed by stress, falling back on routine behavior rather than responding appropriately to the emergency. The captain's training history showed that he struggled with handling unexpected situations, which likely affected his actions during this crisis. Faced with the fire, he seemed to fall back on routine procedures, focusing on landing the plane rather than evacuating it. At 20:36, as they neared the runway, the cockpit voice recorder picked up a loud noise as the fire damaged its wiring, and it stopped recording shortly after the flight engineer called out 30 feet above the ground. The plane landed normally, with black smoke trailing from the fuselage. Although the pilots managed to land the plane with the fire on board and only 2 working engines, simply landing wasn't enough. The plane rolled slowly down the runway for almost 3 minutes before finally stopping, wasting precious time during the fire. Instead of evacuating immediately, the captain allowed the engines to keep running while firefighters approached cautiously. Smoke flooded the cabin, causing chaos as passengers panicked and rushed forward. The flight attendants, trying to maintain order, struggled against the crowd. The captain finally stopped the plane on a taxiway but didn't order an evacuation. Despite requests from air traffic control and the crew's intention to evacuate, it took minutes to shut down the engines and initiate the evacuation. Firefighters couldn't open the plane's doors due to lack of training, and thick, toxic smoke filled the cabin. Tragically, by the time the fire was brought under control, all 301 people on board had died. The fire had caused a flashover, filling the cabin with deadly heat and flames. The investigation blamed the crew for their poor communication and failure to act urgently, and the airport for not training its firefighters properly. As a result of this disaster, aviation safety standards were improved, including the elimination of Class D cargo compartments and better firefighter training. Despite the tragedy, the flight attendants were praised for their heroic efforts in trying to manage the situation and protect the passengers until the very end. Their bravery stands as a powerful example of how professionals should act in emergencies.